Numbers, the story of the wilderness wanderings of Israel, a story which reaches its conclusion in tonight's parsha portion. Now, most people think of the wilderness as an arid desert, something like the Sahara or the Mojave deserts. You know, vast mounds of endless sand being driven by the wind. But those of you who've been with us in Israel know better. We were there, and it's no Sahara. It's a rocky, wild place full of hills and valleys and twisting roads and mountain goats. In other words, it's more like the Dakota Badlands. You know, like the hideout for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. or for that matter, for Jesse James and Billy the Kid, whichever one you prefer. In other words, it's an amazing, wild, and wonderful place. Now, this week's reading closes the book of Numbers. And it's named, as you heard read just a little while ago, for the travels, the journeys, actually the campsites, ma'asot, of the Israelites during the approximately 4-decade-long journey through the wilderness. Now, as you heard in the text that Dr. Patrice read, they are now in the plains of Moab, opposite Jericho. And they're about to cross into the land that God had promised, the land of Israel. And then the reading, interestingly, proceeds to chapter 34 to delineate the territorial boundaries and assign the tribal elders designated to oversee the distribution of this land they're about to enter into. And the text says, interestingly, they're under the overall supervision of Joshua and the high priest Eleazar. Now, if you paid attention to the text as it was read at the very beginning, and in fact, whether or not you paid attention to it, it's still in the text. The text begins with the people being led out under the direction of Moses and Aaron. Now they're under the direction of Joshua and Eleazar. In other words, there has been a transition, a turnover of leadership as the next generation is ready to take over for where their ancestors left off. Now, in the light of this forthcoming distribution of the land that you find in chapter 24, the reading then concludes in a most striking fashion at the end of Numbers 34 by reviewing an incident that had been narrated previously. It seems the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, of the tribe of Manasseh, sought parity with their male relatives in inheriting their deceased father's territory. And the text, earlier text, is clear. God agrees with their request. So in tacit recognition of the daughters' legal triumph, the Torah takes the rather unusual step of prominently recording their names, and then immediately concludes the book with, as you heard it read, these are the regulations, the guidelines which the Lord gave. What the text is saying is, in God's eyes, and from the Torah's perspective, there is to be equality and equity between men and women, and hence it closes the way it does. Now, on each of the 2 previous occasions where the daughters had been mentioned, they are listed in a specific order. However, in our reading, the order varies, it changes, which raises that important question, is the variation significant? To quote one of the modern Jewish scholars, Nechama Leibowitz, appropriately a lady commenting on this text, she says, this informs us that they are regarded equally. Neither one is given preference lest they become jealous of one another, end quote. In other words, God is making it clear to us He shows absolutely no partiality. All of us are considered on equal footing. And then the text concludes. But wait, there's far more to this intriguing parsha, particularly as it begins. Remember, Elem Ma'aseh Bnei Yisrael asher yatz'u me'eretz Mitzrayim vayitov Moshe et motzahehem l'masehem al pi Adonai ve'eleh masehem l'motzahehem. To which you say, what? As you heard me translate, remember I had difficulty trying to translate and separate out between these terms. The translations are interesting. Some translate it journeys and travels. Others translate it, probably better, travels and campsites. Others simply translated as stages in their journey. And all of that tries to get at what's going on. But let me suggest one other thing that struck me from the text as I was looking at it yet again this afternoon. About half a dozen words in it says Yatsu, often translated going forth. Probably best way to translate this in this context is because it describes the Exodus. It's their grand exit from Egypt. It's their exodus from Egypt that is mentioned here. And then from that grand exit, the Exodus, then God leads them on these travels and to these campsites, these stages in their journeys, as a fulfillment of what he had promised Moses, Exodus 33:14. He said there, I will go with you, and I will give you rest. And every time they stopped, they should have understood God was giving them rest at another stage of their journey. And more than that, in Leviticus 26, he reminded them not only would he live among them, he would actually walk among them and walk along the, I know streets is probably not the best way to describe it, but the roads of their campsites. The reality of God among them. The campsites were reminders of that. Now, additionally, we encounter a very interesting construction in our text. And on this, I'm simply going to quote to you from the popular Chumash, or commentary on the Readings of the Week, the Art Scroll edition. It says, their goings forth according to their journeys. At the end of the verse, this same idea is repeated, but the order of the words is reversed, which always should cause you to sit up and take notice. Their journeys according to their goings forth. The first phrase expresses how God regarded their travels, while the second phrase looks at it from the people's point of view. Whenever God ordered them to go forth, he did so because he wanted them to progress with the next stage, progress to the next stage in his plan, to journey toward the destiny he had planned for them. But the people saw things differently. When the time came for them to journey, they rejoiced simply because they were going forth, because they were leaving a place that perhaps had grown tiresome, and not because they were thinking of their long-term goal. Their purpose was not the destination, but the journey itself, end quote. In other words, what this is saying is we tend to focus on the journey and often lose sight of the destiny, the destination. Now, who among us, whether Jew or Gentile, has not experienced wanderings in our existence? And let me suggest, whatever our disappointments, whatever our frustrations, whatever our boredoms that we have encountered, we must, as Israel did, always go forward with God. Future renewal, this text implies for us, for each individual as it was for the nation, calls us to the next challenge, the next stage. And so in this chapter, the Torah summarizes the entire route followed by Israel from the Exodus until they actually stood poised to cross the Jordan to enter the Promised Land, which our reading left us with. The list of journeys, let me suggest, against this background emphasizes God's compassion because it shows that the people enjoyed extended periods of rest with God in the wilderness. Masehen, as the text says. I will go with you, as God promised, and give you rest. But let me suggest at this point we're just getting a little ahead of ourselves, so let me fill in the backstory. The backstory that informs our text and provides us with perspective. It has to do with the very beginning of the wilderness experience, that astounding event that birthed the nation, the giving of that great covenant by God at Sinai. Now, when he did that, among other things, he certainly was forming a government for our people, for the nation, for the land into which they were entering. In other words, it was, in fact, a constitution necessary for nationhood, but the kind of constitution, as we've discovered, that governs all of our lives. But it was more than that. It was, in fact, according to the backgrounds of the ancient Near East, a covenant and not a law code. A covenant, not a law code. In other words, it was grace, not law. And remember the opening words. I am the Lord your God, Exodus 20, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. It is, in fact, described as a covenant of love in Deuteronomy 7, as a Brit Chesed. even a different kind, the lasting or loyal love, or loving kindness, the Old English translates for us. Or in the 7th paragraph of the Amidah, for in the light of your face you gave to us, Lord our God, the Torah of life and love and kindness. That's what this thing was that God gave to us as a grand treasure. And in fact, it was a special kind of covenant. As Yeshua's brother Yaakov in his letter reminds us, it is the royal law of liberty. Royalty, liberty, not slavery here. And furthermore, as we've come to understand, and I want to spend a little time on this, it is another different kind of covenant, is in fact a ketubah, a marriage covenant or contract. And understanding it in that nature tells us something of the nature of our relationship with our God, as established through the Exodus and confirmed by covenant at Sinai. It has to do with marriage, not mastery. It has to do with love, not legalism. It has to do with devotion, not drudgery. And too often we get it all confused. You see, the last verb in the key text that described God's taking of his people at the second interview that Moses had at the burning bush